Untuk mengoptimalkan bonus demografi pada tahun 2045, Indonesia mengerahkan beragam upaya untuk mengentaskan stunting. Angka stunting di Indonesia sudah jauh membaik, di mana tahun 2014 berada di level 37% dan pada tahun 2022 berada di level 21,6%. Namun angka ini masih begitu jauh dari target pemerintah Indonesia yang berada di level 14%. Lalu bagaimana nasib 79 juta anak-anak Indonesia yang berada di bawah umur 18 tahun? Kami berbincang dengan UNICEF Representative in CNBC Indonesia, Maniza Zaman, di CNBC Indonesia Prime Words bersama saya, Safrina Nasution. Dan telah bergabung secara eksklusif di CNBC Indonesia Prime Words, UNICEF Representative Indonesia, Maniza Zaman. How are you, Maniza?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for joining us in CNBC Indonesia.
Thank you.
So UNICEF has been in Indonesia for quite a long time, 75 years. How is actually the role of UNICEF for the children in Indonesia? What is the main focus for the children in Indonesia, especially since your establishment?
Thank you. You know, it's a real privilege to come to Indonesia, a country where UNICEF has been here, as you mentioned, for such a long time. We truly value the trusted partnership that we have with the government of Indonesia to further children's rights in this country. And of course, over that time, so many things have changed. And so UNICEF with that has also changed in terms of the kinds of issues that we're looking at, right? Currently, we're now at a post-pandemic, hopefully, time, and we really have to take stock of what were the issues for children before the pandemic and what are some of the current issues which have come up post-pandemic. So really, if I have to look at, you know, what are some of the main priorities for us here, first and foremost, I would say really shining a light on the children that have been left behind, looking at this country, which is huge and geographically diverse. You do have a lot of children who are doing really well, benefiting from so much, but you still have children in this country who are facing real challenges. Challenges when it comes to nutrition, stunting, as you know, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Issues related to loss of learning.
Learning loss.
Exactly. The COVID pandemic really hit the education system and many other things, of course. Challenges related to immunization and getting the full course of immunization. Challenges related to issues that we call related to child protection. So child marriage, birth registration, water and sanitation also. So there is a multiple issues that we're looking at. While Indonesia has made a lot of progress over the years, we do need to focus on those children that have been left behind. So I would say that's a real priority.
Yeah, the multiple issues here, right?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned about stunting, so I would like to read some data. So until 2021, Indonesia is still listed as the 4th-ranked countries in the world and 2nd in Southeast Asia with the highest number of cases of stunting for the children under 5. What are actually usually the obstacles of dealing with stunting, especially for developing countries like Indonesia?
Thanks a lot. I mean, I think, let me first start with the good news, which is that Indonesia over the years, over the last 10, 15 years, has made good progress in terms of reducing stunting, for sure. And there is a real high-level political commitment here to see stunting go down and down and down, right? So that's really great to have that level of, I think, emphasis on this particular issue. But yes, we still have a challenge. The latest data that's coming out from the nutrition surveys done last year is showing about 21.6% of children under 5 are stunted. Yeah. That's about 1 in 5 children, right? It is like 4.5 million children in this country are facing this issue. So I think it's important to understand what causes stunting before we look at what are the obstacles, what are the solutions. And there, I think, there are several issues. One is related to how children, babies, are actually nourished from the time that they're conceived to especially the first 2 years of life. Yeah,
the first 1,000 days of life.
Absolutely. We call that a window of opportunity. Yeah. Why is that? Because that's when so much of child development is happening and so fast, including the brain. And I think during that time, you know, the brain development is one of the fastest that happens in a life course of a human being. So unless you're able to provide them with the right and proper nutrition during that time, you're going to lose that window of opportunity. So it's the issue of proper infant and young child feeding. It's an important issue. We have the issue related to water and sanitation. We have issues related to health services and so on. So there's multiple factors that contribute to stunting. Let me just give you a couple of data points for Indonesia. The recommendation is that when babies are born, they are breastfed early and for 6 months exclusively. In Indonesia, that is less than 50%. Okay, both early initiation and also exclusive breastfeeding. Then the recommendation is after the 6 months that children are given the right amount, type of nutritious foods that they need for their growth. There too, only 1 in 2 children under 5 are getting what they need. So we have a lot of work to do when it comes to proper infant and young child feeding. Yeah. And I think it's important, as I mentioned to you, water, sanitation, health services. If a child doesn't get proper health services, they get sick. The food that they take in, they cannot digest, etc., etc. So it's a vicious cycle. Yeah. If you have poor water quality, poor sanitation, again, child gets sick, all the nutrients are coming out, they can't absorb as much. So we really need to come together with many different sectors to address the issue of stunting. And sometimes that's not so easy.
Yeah, obviously.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes it's not so easy.
Because, but now that you mention about it's actually need a really high political commitment in tackling stunting issues. What do you think is the commitment that is provided by the government of Indonesia from multiple sectors, especially in tackling stunting issues? And further, how do you see the example of success stories from other countries on tackling stunting, ma'am?
Yeah. I want to come back to kind of a point that I made in terms of the political commitment that I see here in Indonesia. We hear the highest level of leadership here talk about stunting. We hear several ministers. We go to the provincial level. We hear it there. So I do think that there is a high level political commitment. And I know that there's ambitions to bring it down to 14% by 2024. And this is being carefully and closely monitored. So political commitment, I think, is definitely there. When it comes to some of the other countries in this region, we have a country like Vietnam that's managed to halve its stunting rate in just about 10 years, which is remarkable. How? Again, the commitment, the multi-sector approach, understanding what is needed in very specific locations. So it's not that we have this formula and it works everywhere in Vietnam. No, let us look at place by place, what is the key issue, and let's target our approach and adjust our approach accordingly. So Vietnam is a good example. If we go to completely another side of the world, Peru is another country that has managed to do that, halving its stunting rate in less than 10 years. Wow. So there are good examples. I do realize, of course, the population in those countries is,
yes,
of course, much less. The terrain is very different from Indonesia. I think there are certain things that we can learn, but we will have to have an Indonesian kind of tailored solutions to this issue.
The Indonesian tailored solution, 270 million of people in Indonesia, another country, another complexity. What should be the most effective way to implement a stunting alleviation program in a country like Indonesia, even though it's a very, very challenging one?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, Indonesia has a great plan and a strategy in terms of the big picture. You know, what are the elements needed to alleviate stunting and to reduce stunting? I think the issue is, given the diversity of this country, you take a place like Papua, you take a place like Aceh on the extremes, one would really have to understand province, district, village level. What are the key determinants of continued stunting in those areas? What is the most important thing that we need to focus on? In some places, it could be water sanitation. Maybe they have the information that they need in terms of the nutrition, education, health, literacy. But because they have a real problem with water sanitation, it's not moving the way that it needs to. Another place, it could be access. The health workers, nutrition counselors are not able to reach the families because the terrain is so difficult. How do you get that information to those communities? So I think a very localized approach based on data, very good evidence, and using that for the right decisions as we move forward is going to be important.
A very localized approach based on evidence and based on data, because we know that every province has these similarities, as you mentioned before.
Exactly.
And now we're talking about the risks and the dangers of stunting. A lot of people already talk about stunting, but not much has been discussed about what actually is the challenge and what actually is the risk that stunting brings to a nation, to an economy. What are the dangers of the stunting problem, and then especially in terms of the economic effect of stunting?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, everybody knows Indonesia is on a great economic trajectory. Even with the COVID pandemic, the forecasts are extremely positive, and that one has to congratulate the country. It also has a very young population, and I think that is the promise of having a younger generation in terms of really contributing to the aspirations of the country, including the economy. And where do you develop that human capital? In children, you know, that's where you have to start investing. So what happens with stunting, as I was mentioning, that because that really rapid time, that window of opportunity of brain development, for example, if you don't get the right nutrients at that time, you will miss out on the full possibilities of that brain development, okay? So what happens is that with the stunting issue, we actually see that children who are stunted, when they go into education, they have a slightly lesser ability to understand, to learn. We also see later on in life that their earning potential is also reduced. So you are actually having a potential workforce who are not able to be the best that they could be, right?
And fulfilling their potential.
Exactly. And I think there's another issue as well. Studies have shown that stunting is a predeterminant of later on having chronic diseases as well, later on in life. So imagine the health costs in trying to address all that. And so certainly there's a huge economic loss when you have a population or a subset of the population that is suffering from stunting. And in fact, the World Bank data tells us that for every $1 that you invest in a nutrition program, including reducing stunting, you get $48 of return. So it's a very strong return on investment. So it's I think it's an issue, huge issue, one that needs to be urgently resolved. And we really need every single child to really fulfill their best potential.
Yeah, and fulfilling their best potential. And how do we manage the best quality of the window of opportunity, the first 2 years of a child's life?
Exactly.
Right? Well, we will continue our conversation after the break. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Dan demikian, dan dialog bersama dengan UNICEF Representative in Indonesia, Maniza Zaman, akan kita lanjutkan usai jeda. Tetap bersama kami di CNBC Indonesia.
I think it's important also that we spend time with our children, our young people, to expose them to other forms of entertainment, socialization, be it sports, be it the creative arts, etc., being outdoors.
Masih bersama saya Safrina Nasution, dan kita masih berdiskusi bersama dengan UNICEF Representative in Indonesia, Maniza Zaman. How are you, Maniza? Thank you so much for still joining us, and we will continue our discussion.
Sure.
So we're moving on to another issue, the digitalization. Today's children growing up in an increasingly digital world. How to protect children from the danger of accessing the digital world and also anticipating their screen time.
Yeah. Look, it's a great question. I think the digital world is one that has absolutely just captured us in so many ways, your lives, my life, and of course, the younger generation and children. In fact, a study here in Indonesia shows that 95% of 12 to 17-year-olds are online at least twice a day. That's a huge number, 95%, right? And that's the adolescence that we're talking about. But it starts much younger, much younger. And I think I can imagine as a parent, you know, I can't imagine, frankly, raising children in this world, but we have to be pragmatic and we have to be practical and see how best we can support them and protect them, right? Our kids. So maybe there are a few things that I could kind of share with you. First is, I think, really parents, caregivers need to recognize that the digital world is or is going to be part and parcel of every child's, almost every child's life experience. So just recognize that that's a fact, and also try to understand as parents, as caregivers, what that world is about. We also need to understand what that world is about if we're able to have to support our children, right? I think the second thing is to have a really good and open communication with your children, so that as they traverse through their different stages of childhood, yes, they talk about their experience, including their experience in the online world. The open communication is really important, so that they can share what they're seeing, what they're learning, what their experience is. That's important. I think the third element would be set some parameters, meaning
hours of screen times, or?
Yes, indeed, set some parameters. You know, this is hours of screen time. There are things you can do in terms of access to certain sites. You know, so there are controls that can be put in, right? So I think there are certain things that absolutely, you know, as parents and caregivers, we can, so that that world doesn't become their only world. I think it's important also that we spend time with our children, our young people, to expose them to other forms of entertainment, socialization, be it sports, be it the creative arts, etc., being outdoors, you know. I think that's really, really key. And maybe I think the last point that I would say is I think it's important to also have the conversation on what can be put online and what should not be put online. So for example, the permanency of what you put online. Once it's online, you don't take it out, right? I don't know whether children and young people really
Yeah.
understand that. So we have a responsibility as parents.
It's very nice that you mentioned those issues, what to put online and what not to put online, especially on parents posting their pictures on social media for the kids, and also especially the privacy of those children.
Exactly.
And now it really sums up that technology brings benefit, but also brings some cost. And the other cost is also bullying that occur in cyberspace for children. How to anticipate those cases?
So the issue of cyberbullying that you've just mentioned, is extremely important, that we are all aware about it. I think especially the children. So the first thing is, let your children and young people know what cyberbullying is. What does it look like? What does it feel like? So that's kind of number one. I think the second thing is that we need to ensure that the children and young people have somebody trusted that they can go to. It could be the parent and caregiver. It could be somebody else who they really are close to and trust, that they are able to talk about it. They have to be able to talk about it. Because often what happens is the victims of cyberbullying, they don't say anything to anybody. They suffer in silence. And that's traumatic, and it can just continue. So they have to have that feeling that there's a safe space that they can go to and tell people about it, or person about it. I think the third thing, as we are educating our children and young people on this, is also perhaps good to say that don't immediately respond to cyberbullying, because it can just escalate, right? So I think a few tips in terms of when it happens, 1, 2, 3, this is what you can do. And I would also say one other thing is that as parents and caregivers, we also need to model respectful behavior, respectful, kind, even when provoked. There are certain ways of reacting. Children and young people are watching us. And I think they learn from us as well.
Mirroring us.
Yes.
What are we? What you do as
Indeed,
well. And in the midst of the challenge of the digital era, and then also the ever-changing, of very, very dynamic world, what is actually the ideal way of investing for early childhood education, not only from the education side, but also psychological side, holistic sides of it?
So I think, again, the promise of digitalization is huge, right? And firstly, let me just say that at UNICEF, we truly believe that the early years in so many ways are foundational, whether the early childhood education is absolutely key. We see kids who have had that exposure do better in school, full stop. They're prepared, right? So now the issue is the digital world and the instruments that there are. I think it's important to realize that digitalization is an enabler. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the solution to everything, right? So it is, in the education system, it can support better learning. You still need your teacher in many ways, because the socialization, the interaction is important. I think digital tools can give children a varied learning experience, which then helps them get interested and absorb more. I also think that if we're going that direction, teachers need to know how to teach with digital tools, with the chalk and board, as we call it, the traditional ways, to again blend the different tools that they have. And I think that creates a really rich experience. So absolutely there is space, but it needs to be age appropriate. It needs to be tailored to the situation as well, right? So yes, I see a lot of promise. What I will also say is that there are some parts of this country, but certainly globally, where we're seeing a digital divide between those who have access to digital assets and those who don't. And that's a little bit of a concern, because the more we see this, we see certain segments of the population kind of grow so much faster, have so much more access, so much more digitally savvy, and others who may not yet have seen a computer. So we need to be really, really careful, or deliberate, I should say, in making sure that with this, we are not just really widening the gap, that we are also thinking about those kids who just are at a disadvantage and also focusing on them.
Right. Yeah. And adding up to that, before we are moving on to another segment, so we see the development of artificial intelligence, and also how does it affect the labor market in the future. Probably the message from UNICEF, what are actually the most important skills, human skills that can be honed for the children in their upbringing and education, and, you know, facing those challenges in the future of artificial intelligence?
It's a great question. It's an interesting question, because I know that very recently there was the first global conference on this sort of AI for good, so to speak, or for development. I think the science is still developing, to be very honest. It's developing super fast, as we know. But I think there is real promise in it if we're able to harness it in the right way to address, I think, some of the really, yes, big problems, economic issues, etc., but also some of the social problems that we are facing, social development problems. But for children and young people to keep pace, I think they have to have the skill of basically adapting, flexibility, because they need to know how to use all kinds of different media, tools, etc. So flexibility, openness of mind, yes, really, exploration, curiosity. So I think all these attributes in the socialization of children and young people will be really helpful as they navigate this world.
Right. Thank you so much, and we will continue our conversation after the break, Maniza. Dan dialog bersama dengan UNICEF Representative Indonesia, Maniza Zaman, akan kita lanjutkan usai jeda. Tetap bersama kami di CNBC Indonesia Prime Words. What can actually be done to address climate change risk, and how to mitigate its impact for the children in Indonesia?
Thank you for asking that question. Look, it's a crisis. The climate crisis is a child rights crisis, because we're just seeing so much unraveling of all the gains we've made for children. And in the future, that can worsen unless we take action now.
Anda masih menyaksikan CNBC Indonesia Prime Words bersama saya Safrina Nasution, dan kita masih bergabung dengan UNICEF Representative Indonesia, Maniza Zaman. Maniza, thank you so much for still joining us. Now, in the last segment, we're going to talk about a real increasing threat for everyone, the climate change. What can actually be done to address climate change risk, and how to mitigate its impact for the children in Indonesia?
Thank you for asking that question. Look, it's a crisis. The climate crisis is a child rights crisis, because we're just seeing so much unraveling of all the gains we've made for children. And in the future, that can worsen unless we take action now. So in terms of really what UNICEF is calling for are a few things. One is to prioritize children and young people's issues in the climate finance discussions. Second is to prevent the worst from happening by really urgently cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions. Third is really looking at adaptation. How can social services that really serve children, such as education, health, and others, how can those be adapted from the worst impacts of the climate change and crisis that we're facing? And fourth is engage young people, children, educate them so that they can be what they are always and continue to be, our agents of change. They can be the torchbearers of a more hopeful, a more sustainable planet that they can benefit from, and so can we. So those are some of the big picture areas that we're really looking at as UNICEF.
Well, beautiful. And lastly, what are the UNICEF key priorities for the next years, especially in Indonesia?
Yeah. Again, I want to kind of go where perhaps I started, saying that Indonesia has made a lot of progress on child rights on many fronts. We have had a setback because of COVID-19. We are having a setback again because of the climate crisis. So in all that, if we had to look at some of the real areas that we want to be looking at, first and foremost, I think, really to recognize that there is great diversity and there are disparities in the country, meaning that there are certain children that are being left behind. So a laser-sharp focus on really those most disadvantaged, perhaps in remote areas, children who need greater attention. On what kinds of issues? In terms of the stunting issue that we spoke about, of course, really further accelerating, the reduction of stunting, as well as looking at other forms of malnutrition, because at the same time, we are seeing an increasing trend in obesity as well in certain pockets of the population. So we need to be a bit careful. We need to address the learning loss that's happened because of the school closures and the pandemic. So that's another area that we really need to look at and focus on early and foundational skills for children. Right. That's another area. I think the third would be around health, in particular around immunization, because we saw a little bit of a backsliding in immunization during COVID-19. We need to recover that to make sure every single boy and girl in this country has the full set of vaccinations that they need, right? I think another area is looking at water quality and safely managed sanitation, because a strong linkage, obviously, with health, nutrition. Supporting the government to have a really good protection system in terms of child protection from harmful practices, from other types of threats and risks, so child protection. And maybe I would say one more area would be what we call social policy, which is really looking at how our budgets and funding spent on children's issues. That's one area, and bringing data and information on children's rights for decision making. Last but not least, we spoke about it, climate change.
Climate change,
of course, and because that is kind of underpinning lives, every single day for children. So I think it's a lot, but we work in partnership, and that's what's important. This is not what UNICEF alone does. We support the government at all different levels, and we work with a multiple array of partners as well. Yeah,
it's challenging, but it is an absolute continuing progress. Thank you so much for all that UNICEF does towards a better world for our children. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for also joining us in CNBC Indonesia, Maniza. A pleasure and an honor to have you.
Thank you so much.
Dan demikian dialog bersama dengan Maniza Zaman, UNICEF Representative in Indonesia di CNBC Indonesia Prime Words. CNBC Indonesia, Beyond Business.